Hi everyone, in this lecture we are going to talk about grid template rows. Now everything that we have studied for grid template columns, they also apply to grid template rows. It's that simple. So in the HTML, we have the same HTML that we used to have. And let's just go ahead and let's take a look at some values for grid template rows. So first I'm going to grab our container. Let's say display flags. What am I saying? I told you that it would be ironic that when I talk about flexbox, I always say grid, and when I talk about grid, it's I always will say flex. It's really tongue twisters. So here is our grid. We can't see it, but we can't visualize it right this way. So here's our grid. I'm sure you can see the lines. I should have probably come up with a better color. I didn't notice that the lines aren't that visible. So if I go to a sort of yellowish kind of color, I think the lines will be better. There we go. So now I'm sure you can see the lines. There we go. So these are grid row lines, and the vertical ones, they're grid column lines. First, let's go ahead and let's create some columns for ourselves. I'm going to say grid template columns. Repeat. So I'm going to have 3 columns. All of them will be 1 FR. Let's save that. Let's take a look at it here. So we have 1, 2, and 3 columns. And we are ending up with almost 7 rows. Yes, and now let's go ahead and let's create rows for us. So the property name is going to be grid template rows. The idea is the same. So the number of rows, the number of value units that you add in here, they're going to define how many rows you're going to end up with. So we have already talked about how it is important for you to let the content decide what the height is going to be. If you don't want to have fixed section heights, that's why using grid template rows with pixels is the most terrible thing that you could do to your grid. That is the most horrible thing that you can do to your grid, is use grid template rows with hard-coded values like pixels. You don't have to do anything with rows. You could create rows, but there are other keywords which we're going to cover towards the end of this series, towards the end of this grid section of the series, and they're going to tell the content, okay, hey, you content, you can decide what the height of this row is going to be. I am just giving this, I am abdicating this control over to you. But for just demonstration purposes, for teaching purposes, I'm going to use pixel values, but this is not recommended. So I'm going to say 150, 150. Let's have 4 columns and 5 rows. There we go. So 150 is a lot. Let's reduce them by 275. So we have 5 rows. Each of them has a height of 75 pixels, and we have 4 columns for which the value for each column is going to be 1 FR. Now, these vertical lines are grid column line. The horizontal lines are grid row line. One individual item is placed within a grid cell. So a grid cell places in itself a grid item. And let's see, what else do I have to talk about here? So we talked about grid cells, we talked about grid lines, grid columns. Now, the number of columns that you have in this horizontal direction, these columns, this is going to create a grid row track. And these rows, stacking on top of each other, this is going to create a grid column track. And yes, you heard me correctly. Horizontally, we have, even though you are basically crossing over columns, you have grid row because row goes horizontal. And vertically, you have grid column track. So this is 1 track for columns, 2 tracks, 3 and 4 tracks. We have 4 column tracks and 5 row tracks. Okay, so let's see. We also have grid area, and the total space surrounded by 4 grid lines is called a grid area. Now, within a grid area, there could be any number of cells. So let's say this grid line number, column line number 3, and grid column line number 4. So this is one line, and this is the other line. Let's say the first line here is grid row line 1, and then grid row line 6. So this is going to become a grid area. The total space surrounded by 4 grid lines is a grid area. So in this case, we have 5 cells within this grid area. If you extend this grid area from 3 to 2, you're going to end up with 10 grid cells. A grid cell is a space between 2 adjacent row grid lines and 2 adjacent column grid lines. So adjacent means next to each other, neighboring, close in proximity. Each of these individuals, like this is, this row line is adjacent to this one, and this column line is adjacent to this one. The space surrounded by these 4 lines is a grid cell. These are actually all of the grid terminologies that you need to learn. Now let's go ahead and let's create some more rows. Grid template rows. We could also use the repeat function. I'm going to say 4 rows, and I want to have 350 pixels, which is going to be a lot. Let's say 100 pixels. I'm going to say 5 rows and 100 pixels of height. There we go. It's a little bit more. And the way that you can name grid row lines is going to be the same as with grid column lines. So I'm going to say grid template rows. First, using the bracket notation, of course, I'm going to say row dash 1, row dash 1 dash start. There is actually something that I forgot to mention in our previous lecture. I'm going to mention that here, and it is going to be applied on grid template columns as well. So I'm going to say row dash 1 dash end. Let's copy this entire thing. 2, 3, 4, and 5. Make sure you don't mess this up. It's a little bit confusing to follow. So this is 2 and row 2 end, row 3 start, 3 end, and then we have 4 start, 4 end, 5 start, 5 end. Now the thing that I forgot to mention in our previous lecture was that any line, whether that is a column line, a grid column line, or a grid row line, it could have more than one name. It could have 2 names, 3 names, 10 names, as many names as you want to provide it. So how do you know that? Is that you can see that this is the first row track. This is the first row track. The starting line has this name. The ending line has this name. But the ending line could have this name as well as this one. So the ending could be row 1 end. If you do that, that is going to be, again, the ending of the first row track. If you do row 2 start, that is going to be the same name for that as well. So there are 2 names here, and then you could have another name for them, which is going to be their original name, like 2, 3, 4. And when you have these kind of 2 names, what you could do is you could basically specify them or separate them just using a space, not providing 2 brackets. So I'm going to delete these. I'm just going to specify a space here, and I'm going to save. So now this belongs to this line, to the ending of this line. This is going to belong to the starting of this line. And now you could do that as well. There we go. Let's row 2 end, row 3 start. And then there we go. And this is a valid syntax as well. So with this, our lecture comes to an end. See you in the next one.